first talk today is by Hannah Brotherton here, who's a second year PhD student. She's working with Kevin Monroe and Chris Black. She's also working with Roland Shater from UCL. And and Mike Maslin as well, right? Sorry. So Hannah's doing some really interesting work in auditory plasticity, which involves either depriving people of auditory input by giving them earplugs or boosting their auditory input by giving them hearing aids, looking at what's the impact on auditory processing. This could have interesting applications in explaining why people get tinnitus, for example, or hyperacusis. So Hannah's going to take it away and give us a little talk about her research.
Okay, thank you. So my talk is about my first study for my PhD. I'm investigating the central gain mechanism in normal hearing in listeners after they wear an earplug in one ear. And understanding more about the central gain mechanism will hopefully lead to a better understanding about the development of tinnitus and hyperacusis. So I've only got 15 minutes, so I'm going to briefly introduce you to this gain mechanism and its implication in tinnitus and hyperacusis. I'm going to cover a very recent study that forms the general motivation of my PhD. However, there are other studies, but I can't discuss them in this short period of time. And I'm going to introduce you to some preliminary findings from study 1 of my PhD. So what is a central gain mechanism? Well, a change in this central gain mechanism acts to compensate for changes in the auditory environment. For example, if there's a reduction in the auditory input, this gain mechanism increases the neural activity to maintain normal neuronal levels. So if we take this figure here, this was created by Roland from UCL. If this gain mechanism isn't present, which is represented by these circles here, and it isn't turned up in response to a reduction in auditory input, as shown by high frequency hearing loss, then the mean activity of the neurons is reduced. There's an imbalance in the excitatory and inhibitory activity of the central auditory neurons. And this also leads to a reduction in the spontaneous activity in the central auditory system. But this gain mechanism is present, and when there's a reduction in auditory input, the central auditory system turns the gain up. It increases the excitatory gain and decreases the inhibitory gain to maintain normal neuronal activity. But this increase in excitatory gain causes an over-amplification of spontaneous activity, and this is suggested to be involved in the development of tinnitus. And likewise, an increase in gain increases the stimulus-evoked activity, which is suggested to be involved in the development of hyperacusis. So little is known about the characteristics of this gain mechanism, where along the auditory pathway it operates. Does it only operate at frequencies where there's a reduction in auditory input, or does it have a broader effect? So understanding more about this mechanism will let us understand if it's a feasible target for the treatment of tinnitus and hyperacusis. So my PhD is trying to understand this mechanism in more detail. So the first study I'm going to talk about is a very recent one, just recently published, and they looked at the effect of unilateral earplug deprivation in normal hearing listeners on acoustic reflex thresholds and loudness judgments. So this is a physiological measure of the gain mechanism, and loudness judgments is a perceptual measure of the gain mechanism. And they plugged them in one ear for a continuous period of 7 days, and they only measured ipsilateral reflex thresholds at frequencies 0.5 and 2 kilohertz, and the same frequencies for loudness judgments. So this is the layout for the experiment. They gathered baseline measures at day 0, and then they placed an earplug in one ear. It was allocated to one ear, and the investigator was blinded to the ear. They then got them back after 7 days of unilateral earplug use, and the reflexes and loudness judgments were measured on day 7. They then had them come back in 24 hours after the removal of the earplug, and this allowed them to see the pattern of recovery of this gain mechanism. And then also they got them in 7 days after the removal of the earplug. And during these same sessions, the control ear was also measured. So these are the results for ipsilateral reflex thresholds. You can see the pattern of change is similar for both frequencies, but I'll just quickly concentrate on the 2 kilohertz and describe what they found. So this is the mean reflex threshold values across the different time periods. So they've looked at day 0, 7 and 8. And at day 0, there's asymmetry in the reflex thresholds between ears. But following 7 days of earplug deprivation, in the plugged ear, there's a reduction in the reflex threshold. And then this reverts back to baseline level, the majority of the recovery occurs 24 hours after the removal of the earplug. The opposite effect is seen in the control ear. After 7 days of earplug use, there's an increase in the reflex threshold, and majority of the recovery has taken place by 24 hours after the removal of the earplug. I will just add, full recovery had taken place by 7 days after the removal of the earplug. And this difference between the ears was around 4.9 dB, and it was statistically significant. But you can see that there is a similar pattern at the lower frequency. It is a smaller magnitude of change, and the difference is around 3 dB between the ears, and it was marginally significant. So does this tell us that this gain mechanism is frequency specific? That is, the earplug provided more attenuation at these higher frequencies than the lower frequencies. That's still under debate because of the sample size, so this is what I've got to investigate. And this is the findings for the loudness judgments. So the graphs show the level change comparing before and after treatments of the loudness categories. That is, the participants were asked to rate different sound intensities to these loudness categories. And what we can see here is that if there was no change for loudness treatments after the earplug deprivation, these lines would be at 0, but we can see that there was a change. So if I concentrate at the plugged ear at the higher frequency of 2 kilohertz, participants required around 8 dB less sound to match pre-treatment loudness judgments. And this was statistically significant for the higher loudness categories. And what we can see is that this pattern is also evident at the lower frequency. But the most interesting fact about this is that the control ear also shows the same change in the same direction, which is in contrast to the reflex thresholds, which showed an equal and opposite change. So does this tell us that the gain mechanisms underlying reflex thresholds and underlying loudness perception are different, and maybe they're operating at different levels in the auditory system? That still needs to be investigated in more detail. So there are gaps in knowledge, not only from this study, but also previous ones, which I can't go into more detail about. So limited frequencies, they've only looked at 2 frequencies, low and high, only ipsilateral reflex thresholds, only unilateral deprivation, unclear pattern of onset, they only looked at 0 to day 7, what's the pattern of the changing gain during those days? Not clear what the pattern of recovery is, because they looked only 24 hours later. Does it operate on an hour basis? And also, what's the relationship between loudness and reflex thresholds? So some of these I've addressed in study 1 of my PhD. So my first study involves unilateral earplug deprivation in normal hearing listeners for a period of 6 days. It's ongoing. I've recruited 17, and I ideally want to recruit up to 26. I looked at both ipsilateral and contralateral reflex thresholds, and I looked at 5 frequencies. Okay, so this is the layout of my study. I'll just try and describe this in as much detail as I can. So I got them for, the first session is the suitability, to see if they matched the criteria that I set. And also, it allowed me to introduce the earplug to them to make sure they were comfortable with the duration of the study and to answer any questions that they had. Then I had the day 0. This is the baseline measure. So I had day 0, I measured their reflex thresholds on this day. I then allocated the earplug to one ear, and this I was blinded to. I then got them to come back in 2 days later. I was still blinded to the ear because they had to cover their ears during sessions, and I couldn't guess which ear either it was. And then they were asked to put the earplug back into the same allocated ear after they left the test session room. And they came in 4 days after and 6 days after. So they wore the earplug for 6 days. I then want them to come in 4 hours after the removal of the earplug to see what this pattern of recovery is, and also 24 hours afterwards. And during these same sessions, the control ear was tested. So these are the results for the ipsilateral reflex thresholds. These are the mean values across different days. I wouldn't normally add that suitability session because this day, day 0, is the baseline day, but I wanted to show you something that I found, that there's a symmetry between the ears on this suitability session, but not on the day 0. It's not as clear, and I'm not sure what's causing that and why it's always higher in the control ear and lower in the plugged ear, because I haven't allocated the ears yet, so I'm still trying to figure this out. Maybe I just need to increase the sample size. But what you can see is that there is a reduction in the reflex threshold all the way to day 4, and it's gradual across the days, and it maintains between 4 and 6. That's around a 1 dB difference, and there is recovery. There is recovery evident at 4 hours after the removal of the earplug. And again, there's majority of the recovery is taking place by day 7, but not all of the recovery. And the control ear doesn't show much change. So the findings are similar to the previous study that I mentioned. And again, the effect is evident at 4 kilohertz. I haven't showed you the other frequencies because there's not much of an effect. So this could tell us that it is a frequency-specific gain mechanism, but I need to increase my sample size to make sure. And I haven't done any statistical analysis yet because it's still ongoing. But it's the pattern is it could be frequency specific. So contralateral reflex threshold. So the hypothesis is contralateral reflex thresholds will tell us where along the auditory pathway the gain mechanism is occurring. How? Because if the gain is occurring in the ascending auditory pathway, when you present the sound to the plugged ear, there should be a reduction when the probe is measured from the other side, because this tells us the gain has increased in this ear, so it needs a lower sound level to elicit the reflex. And this is what we found, is that there's a clear reduction when the sound is presented to the plugged ear, so we're measuring from the control ear, and it's gradual to day 6, and there is some recovery evident by 4 hours and 24 hours later. And this is also evident at 4 kilohertz. The pattern is quite not as clear for the when the sound is presented to the unplugged ear, so when it's swapped around. And again here it decreases, but then it increases at day 4. So I'm not sure what's going on with that one, but again it could be sample size. At the lower frequencies, there's not much of a pattern again. So again, this says maybe it's a frequency-specific effect. So the conclusion is these findings does support evidence of a gain control mechanism where an earplug deprivation causes an increase in gain, and this is revealed by a lower sound level needed to elicit a reflex. It progressively changes over the course of the period of deprivation. But for the ipsilateral, it may plateau between day 4 and 6, but again, I need to increase my sample size. It's likely to be operating in the ascending auditory pathway, but I need to have more proof of that because obviously there's a slight reduction and there's not a clear pattern when the sound is presented to the uncontrolled ear, to the plugged ear, to the unplugged ear. And there is recovery evident 4 hours after the removal of the earplug. So maybe the recovery, the offset of the change in gain could be quicker than the onset of the change in gain. Thank you.
Yeah, sure.
Can you go back a slide, please?
Which one?
This one, yeah?
Yeah.
So you say, and maybe you already explained it just once again, recovery evident 4 hours after the removal of the earplug. Did you measure closer to the removal? So you can't say that, because I was thinking what's happening in those 4 hours, how quick the recovery is.
Yeah.
Is it immediate?
I mean, that's going to be something I want to address in my next studies, because now we know it is happening within the 4 hours. Now we need to try and figure out how quickly, because it looks like it's happening, the offset is quicker than the onset, which is interesting.
So I think that the sort of time frame really gives you some insight That's really
Yeah, the next study I hope is going to be, because the gain, the change in reflex thresholds is evident within 2 days, and also evident within 4 hours after removal of the earplug. So if I get the next study to be 2 days and then measure within the 2 days, and then measure within the 4 hours, then I'll get a better understanding of the pattern of change.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Yeah. I was just wondering if you're going to take into account your frequency-dependent sound attenuation from your earplugs, and whether that might affect your results if you account for that at the different ART test frequencies. Like, probably going to get more attenuation at higher frequencies with your earplugs than you are with.
Yeah, so the concept is that because I'm providing more attenuation at higher frequencies, the hypothesis is the gain should be increased only at those frequencies, because that's the only place it needs to compensate for the sound reduction. So my findings do support that, that it is frequency specific, but I hope to try and find an earplug or develop an earplug that attenuates lower frequencies and see if it is frequency specific by seeing if it only changes at the lower frequencies. So that will provide more evidence that it is a frequency specific effect.
Thanks very much, Hannah.
Thank you.